I saved $140,000 for my dream wedding, but my parents lied about a medical emergency and used it all to fund my brother's lavish honeymoon. Hello, so I, 26F, recently married my hubby, 26M, following a 6-year romance. We arranged a private ceremony at his aunt's farmhouse, which was not what we had intended at first. I had wanted to marry on the beach, because it was where we had some of our happiest moments. My husband and I are both water lovers, and we would go to the beach at least once a month to relax and decompress, so it is a particular place for us. I had already begun searching for places where we could all stay, like every other bride on the planet. I wanted my wedding to be memorable. I had been saving for a big celebration for the past 5 years. I work in advertising and make a decent living. However, my husband and I lived cheaply and tried to save money for the future. We had planned to hire one of the top hotels with a sea view so that our guests could have a great experience. It was supposed to be a luxury experience, but we had to adjust our plans and cut back significantly because my parents decided to borrow money from me a few months ago. I could not force myself to decline. Some context. My brother, 24, got married a few months ago. However, his wedding was unexpected and they had little time to plan. He had been with his wife for roughly 2 years and proposed about a month before they married. It was a tiny ceremony with only family and a few friends, but I was thrilled for him because it was his wedding and his decision. However, a few weeks after his wedding, my mother contacted me and requested that I borrow $125,000. She told me that my father had suddenly become ill. She claimed it was probably his diabetes acting up again, but she couldn't afford all of the medical bills alone and needed my assistance. She stated that the doctors had recommended a specialized medicine, but it was too expensive because it had to be imported. Their insurance wouldn't cover it, and she couldn't afford it. I was quite concerned about my father's health, so I decided to stand up and lend her the money. No questions asked. I visited them a few times and begged my mother to show me the medical papers, but she always managed to avoid my questions when I visited. My father was always in bed. However, for some reason, he did not appear to be really sick. Even when I asked my mother why he hadn't been taken to a hospital for observation and expert treatment, she said it wasn't required just now, but that he was unwell enough to require an unusual prescription that wasn't even manufactured here and wasn't covered by their insurance. I am not an idiot. After the first few encounters, I realized there was something strange going on with my folks, but I didn't want to accuse them of anything until I was really certain. It would be a bad look if I accused them of lying about a medical emergency in order to borrow money, only to find out later that it was real. The big revelation. I quickly discovered that my brother had not been visiting our parents, even when I asked why. My father said they didn't want him to worry because he was so young. They wanted him to concentrate on his work. They were absolutely cool with me being worried sick. After a few weeks had gone and my brother still had not visited, I decided to phone him. I asked when he was going to stop by to see our father. That's when he casually mentioned that he'd pay me a visit as soon as he returned from his honeymoon. That was news to me. I had no idea he had left for his honeymoon, because my parents had not informed me. I had no idea where he was, because neither he nor his wife had posted anything about it on social media. When I inquired why he hadn't told me, he explained that he had planned to surprise everyone by returning after a month away with a collection of images, tales, and recollections from their tour around Europe. He stated that he had no intention of notifying me, but he was concerned when I mentioned that our father was sick, so he felt compelled to respond. He told me that after receiving my concern text, he spoke with our parents, who assured him that there was nothing to worry about and that they were okay. He explained that our parents had most likely exaggerated the scenario while talking to me, and I had believed them because I was neurotic, resulting in a misunderstanding. I tried to give my parents the benefit of the doubt, believing that they had been keeping the truth from my brother because they didn't want to ruin his honeymoon or make him worry about them. I knew what I had seen in my parents' house, and there was no room for misunderstanding. But then my brother told me that if what I had predicted about Dad being terribly sick had come true, he would have felt terrible about not being there for him. Apparently, our parents paid for his excessively expensive and lengthy honeymoon. All of the danger bells went off in my head. So, I asked him how much this trip would cost him. Then he told me that this trip would cost our parents at least $135,000 because he and his wife were going all out for their honeymoon, staying in the most costly hotels and eating at the best restaurants because they could only do it once. They would also be shopping for a lot of things. and our parents would cover the cost. I realized right away that this was where my money was going, and there was no medical emergency at all. There had never been an emergency, so they had no documentation to show me and had never even been to the hospital. My parents had merely made up the entire narrative in order to raise funds for my brother's honeymoon, which was meant to be their wedding gift. I felt incredibly insulted hearing my brother speak about how our parents went above and beyond for him just so the two of them could enjoy their honeymoon, because they hadn't been able to have a lavish wedding. The money I had lent to my parents came from my wedding fund, and I felt as if I had been stabbed in the back when I discovered that my parents had handed it all to my brother. When I challenged them, after that phone call, my parents informed me that they had to make up a tale because they knew I would not give them the money if I knew it would be spent for my brother's honeymoon. They told me he had been suffering at work and feeling unhappy for a long time, so they wanted him to have some fun without worrying about money. Unfortunately, they were unable to fund it themselves because it would jeopardize their own retirement fund, so they had to borrow money from me. Their reasoning was that I was still young and earning, and I had many years ahead of me to work and recoup this money, but it was not the same for them. They also stated that it was merely money which they would refund at some point, but for the time being, I needed to put myself second and consider my brother's sentiments, as this honeymoon appeared to have reinvigorated him and saved him from depression. I couldn't believe it, because it meant I'd have to cut back on my wedding spending for no apparent reason. To be clear, I was fine with having a smaller wedding if it meant my father's health didn't suffer, but this was not what I had signed up for. I was upset when they told me the truth, and I demanded that they repay me before I married, because I intended to use the money for my wedding. I had a lot of expenses to consider if I wanted to go forward with a beach wedding. Even though my husband and his family were covering part of the expenses, I needed to look after myself as well. My parents had never planned to pay for the wedding, since they had informed me very early on that they could either pay for my college education or pay for my wedding, but not both. I had planned to go to college and pay for my own wedding, so I had been saving up for it alone. In case any of you are wondering, when my brother entered college, I asked him whether our parents had forced him to choose between these two as well, and he laughed in my face as if it were the most absurd concept ever. I never brought it up with my parents because I didn't want to accuse them of having a favorite, even though it was obvious that they did. But I was young and still needed their assistance, because I couldn't find work at the time. So bringing these issues up and battling with them would simply exacerbate the situation for me. It didn't make sense to confront them about this. However, it came out several years later when I confronted them about the money they had stolen from me and how they had always preferred my brother over me. They attempted to deny it, but it was as obvious as day. I told them they had to repay me, because I was not going to give up my ideal wedding just because my brother was struggling at work. My parents could mollycoddle him by sending him on an extravagant vacation with their own money, but I hadn't worked hard for 5 years and saved enough for my wedding simply to have that amount taken away from me and given to my brother. Yet they told me that they couldn't refund the money to me all at once before the wedding and that it would take them a few years to do so. They expected me to be fine with it, since evidently nothing is more important than family. If I was willing to spend that money on a medical emergency for my father, there was no reason why I couldn't use it to save my brother from falling into depression. But here's the thing. My brother would never be depressed because of his job, since he never took it seriously, which is why he was awful at it and earned so little. He works in sales, and practically all of his money comes from commissions, so if he's bad at what he does, he only has himself to blame. He might have been upset about it, but I can assure you that he was never going to get despondent. He simply didn't care enough about anything, because he had been spoiled by my parents his entire life and was unaccustomed to working hard for things, which is why he appeared dissatisfied with his job. That's all it was. However, my parents exaggerated the situation to make it appear that he was worried about his work failures and needed to be rescued. It was all a bunch of nonsense. I attempted to tell my parents how important this wedding was to me. I had previously promised my husband and his family that I would cover certain expenses, which would be difficult if I didn't have the money. Therefore, they needed to take action. But they said they couldn't refund the money to me before I got married, so I'd have to scale back or ask my spouse and his family for help. It got to the point where I begged them to return my money, but all they did was shake their heads and say no, promising to return it someday, but not before the wedding. I left their house crying, and when I returned home and informed my husband what had happened, he was just as angry, and even more unhappy, as I was. He was planning to contact a lawyer, but I told him there was no point because there was no written confirmation that my mother wanted the money for medical reasons or that she intended to return it to me. It had all been informal, with no binding contracts or documentation to substantiate a single point. So, even if we did file a case against her, we would be wasting more of our money by hiring a lawyer, because we would most likely be unable to establish anything. Everything had been verbal and off the record. As much as we wanted to pursue my parents, we decided against it, because it would be fruitless and we didn't want to waste any more money on a hopeless scenario. Instead, we decided to start thinking about how we would adjust our wedding plans. Thankfully, my husband's family stepped in when they discovered what my parents had done. His aunt agreed to let us use her farmhouse venue for free. We had always wanted to have a beach wedding, but his aunt hadn't recommended it at first. However, now that we were looking at other options, she offered that idea, and I decided to check it out. My husband had visited the location before, but the moment I walked in, I knew it was the one. It was a wonderful location, and even though it was not near the ocean, my husband and I were delighted. His aunt was allowing us to use the venue for free, which gave us even more motivation to start planning around the farmhouse instead. I became preoccupied with wedding preparations, which gave me yet another reason to distance myself from my parents. I had already decided that they were not going to be invited to my wedding, but I was on the fence regarding my brother, because he hadn't done anything wrong and didn't realize my parents had taken the money from me to give it to him. However, he made the decision much simpler for me by calling me after he returned from his honeymoon and berating me for humiliating our parents by requesting that they return my money. He told me that he had heard what had happened from our mother and was angry that I was being so difficult about it. Apparently, he thought this was no great thing, despite the fact that he had spent my money and promised to return it to me as soon as he could. But I had to suck it up before the wedding and scale back, so that's when I decided how I felt about him, and I didn't speak to any of them after that. Now that I didn't have the complete wedding fund, I couldn't afford a lavish, extravagant wedding. To be honest, I believe it worked for me, because the wedding I did have was far more lovely than anything I had envisioned previously. We had to reduce our expectations, but it was worthwhile, since we realized that this day was supposed to be about us. We were not the individuals we were attempting to portray in our daily lives. Spending a fortune on a big wedding solely to impress people would be incredibly shallow. We decided to cut the wedding costs and instead do something better with the money we saved. In a way, I'm grateful for how things turned out, since my wedding was still lovely and wonderful, but it lacked the pomp and show that I had envisioned previously. It was a good thing, since we were only surrounded by people we loved and who loved us when we came together to celebrate. I believe that is pretty much all you need for a wedding, so I'm pleased with how things turned out. I posted images for my wedding a few days ago. Everyone in my family who had been invited had been given strong and precise instructions to ensure that my parents and brother did not find out that the invites had already been sent. If they found out, they'd throw a fit, since they didn't get one. This is how we were able to have a private ceremony without them coming up or attempting to coerce me into inviting them before the wedding. But now that it was finished and everything had gone smoothly, I didn't see anything wrong with sharing the images on social media. However, they discovered it and contacted me the next day, demanding an explanation for why they had not been invited to my wedding. I was surprised that they expected to be invited, given that my previous conversations with them had not been good. I had been crying as I left my parents' house after our previous quarrel, and we hadn't spoken since the last time I spoke with my brother. He made me feel like everything was my fault, that I was the one who was being theatrical. After that, I hadn't spoken to any of them, and they hadn't attempted to speak with me either, so I wasn't sure why they had expected to be welcomed. They had not only expected me to invite them, but they were also disappointed that they were unable to attend the wedding. My parents called me first, then joined my brother on the call so they could all yell at me at the same time. But I didn't like it, and it seemed extremely entitled of them. I'd already cut them out of my life, and I didn't need any more turmoil while trying to enjoy my new life as a bride. So I told them that after they took my money, I needed to lower the wedding budget. I decided to invite only family and a few close friends, and because they were neither, they were not included. After that, I hung up and blocked them, hoping they would leave me alone. But an hour later, my husband told me that my brother had contacted him to notify us that my parents had been deeply offended by what I had said. My mother was upset. She kept crying until she almost fainted. That was all he said. But I began to feel guilty because I hadn't meant to offend my parents so deeply. He could be bluffing, But I'm not sure, and hearing this has made me feel strangely bad for not inviting my parents and brother to my wedding after they stole money from my wedding fund. Update 1. Hello, it's been a week since my last chat with my parents and brother, and I've chosen not to speak to them again. My mother can cry all she wants, but it won't change the facts. I was crying so hard the day I confronted them about the money, and I even begged them to return it to me before the wedding, but they didn't seem to care. They took it quite lightly, and now I was going to do the same to them. You reap what you sow. I also warned my brother not to contact me or my husband, particularly my husband, because he had nothing to do with any of this and I didn't want my family bothering him with their petty antics. I banned him again after that text, since I didn't want my family to have any contact with me. They had mistreated me my entire life, and now I was not going to take it anymore. I vow that if I could, I would file a lawsuit against them to recover my money. However, given the lack of actual evidence, that may be a long shot at the moment. My husband feels it's worth a shot and might just work, so we've been thinking about it. He has spoken with a reputable lawyer, and we will decide what to do in a few days. Until then, I just need to figure out how to get them to confess or admit that they borrowed the money from me under the pretense of using it for a medical emergency, but then gave it to my brother so he could have a fun honeymoon. It will be difficult to prove in court, but I refuse to let them off the hook so easily. I deserve to have my money returned, and I will do everything it takes to ensure that they do it as soon as possible. Update 2. Yesterday, I warned my brother not to worry my husband with our family drama, so he apparently interpreted it as a sign to pull him into this, despite the fact that he is not involved. After we arrived home from work, my husband informed me that my parents and brother had sent him a slew of SMS messages demanding that he speak with me and instruct me to unblock them. When he blocked them, they decided to escalate the situation by showing up at his workplace. Apparently, they had been waiting for him outside, and as soon as they saw his car go, they began tailing him and honking. So he had to stop and wait for them to catch up, because he recognized my brother's car and knew it was them. He also knew that if he didn't stop and wait for them, they'd just follow him home, which would greatly disturb me. So he decided to take one for the team and indulge their nonsense. When he pulled over, my brother exited his car, approached his window, and stated that they wanted to meet with him in person. There was a diner nearby, and my spouse was eager to get it over with. They took a booth in the diner so that my family could express whatever they felt was so vital. My brother informed him that he didn't think it was fair for me to cut everyone off over money and that it was an overreaction. They also thought my implication that we were no longer family because they had borrowed money from me went too far. I had previously blocked them so they couldn't contact me, but they knew that if my husband tried to chat with me, I might just listen. They were attempting to appeal to him, and my husband could remind me that we were a family regardless, so I needed to act like it rather than throwing tantrums over minor misunderstandings and acting like a brat. My parents also stated that they intended to repay the money to me later, but they were unable to do so all at once. They'd already stated it to me 1,000,000 times, so I needed to be more considerate because my brother was suffering at work and my parents were due to retire in a few years. They were attempting to persuade my husband that this was entirely my fault and that I was acting out for no reason, but my husband handled it very effectively. Rather than putting them in their place, he entertained them and made them feel like he was on their side. He told them that while he could try to explain it to me, it would be far more helpful if they came out to me personally and wrote me a meaningful note. So far, they had only been accusatory against me, but my husband persuaded them that if they admitted their mistakes, it would calm me down, and those idiots actually purchased it. My spouse tricked them into sending me a message in which they admitted what they had done, leading them to assume that this would make me easy on them. They assumed I would eventually apologize to them, since tone was everything. It's all nonsense, of course. Since the moment they sent that communication, we treat it as an admission of guilt and pursue them criminally. I am actually very pleased with my husband, since he handled this far better than I would have, and I believe he is an evil genius, but he's my evil genius, and I adore him. Update 3. My husband's strategy worked, and we are quite excited right now. My dad and brother, like a bunch of fools, sent me an email listing every single lie they had told and admitting to everything they had done. So now that we have documentation, my husband has granted our lawyer permission to proceed with a petition, and we will soon receive our money back. $125,000 may not seem like much to other people, but it means a lot to me, because I've spent the previous 5 years trying to save for the future and have worked really hard to get where I am now. It took a lot of late hours and sacrifices, and I'm not going to let it all go to waste just because my brother is lazy and my parents want to help him. So we will sue them, and whatever it takes, we will get my money back. We've already begun arranging our honeymoon, which will be a brief vacation to the beach because that's where it all began and will always be precious to us. We might take a longer break in a couple of months and treat it like a vacation, but for the time being, this will have to suffice. We know we don't need to impress people or spend a lot of money. We can do whatever makes us happy, and we are doing just that. Also, I don't want to be like my brother, who shared images from his honeymoon after they returned just to stick it in people's faces. But now he's going to be sued for just that. It's incredibly awful for them, but they brought it on themselves, so they completely deserve whatever comes their way. Thank you for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do so and hit the notification bell to stay updated with more shocking real-life stories happening around you.